Good morning and welcome to the Drop Site News live stream. A reminder, if you're not getting our morning newsletter, which is called Drop Site Daily, it really is the best way to start your day, to get caught up on what's going on around the world. It's become like an extraordinarily useful device for me as well. So you can get that at dropsitenews.com. If you are getting it and you haven't told everyone you know about it, make sure you're doing that. All right. So on today's live stream, first I'm going to be joined by Jeremy Scahill to talk about his new investigation, new long form piece he published yesterday at Dropsite about the conflicts and decision making inside the Palestinian community, which includes both resistance factions as well as more establishment figures, on what the path forward is today. The Palestinian Authority coming out again, coming after Jeremy this morning. For the piece, we'll talk about that and what his response is to it. Afterwards, we're going to be joined by British journalist Sami Hamdi, who you may have seen in the news for being detained after Laura Loomer and some other right-wing activists came after him and demanded that he be locked up and deported. The Trump administration complied. He spent about 2 weeks in detention and then was deported. He'll be joining us from the UK. And then finally, on the back end of the show, we'll talk about the shocking election results in Honduras. And we'll be joined again by José Luis Granados Ceja. He'll be here for his third straight week. 3 weeks ago, he was here to talk about the Mexico City protests. Last week, he was here to preview the Honduran elections, and today he'll be here to talk about what happened there. He was in Honduras, touring the country, visiting various precincts. He can unpack what went wrong for the left there and what went right for the Trump administration and their preferred candidate. So, but joining us now is Jeremy Scahill. Jeremy, we're getting fancy. Intern MJ created some elements for us, so I can actually put your story up on the screen here. The headline over at which you can find the story over Dropsite: Trump, Gaza, and Oslo Déjà Vu. So for people who haven't read it yet, you talk a little bit about the piece that you and Jawa put up yesterday and why it's generating so much attention.
Yeah, I mean, at Dropsite, we've been trying to interview people that are largely verboten in the broader Western media landscape. So we interview people from Hamas, we talk to people from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and we've been doing an in-depth series examining how not just Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but Palestinian political parties and factions are responding to the edicts of Trump's plan. And recently I attended a very large conference of people from throughout the Palestinian diaspora and Palestine itself, where they were discussing these various issues. And you had people from secular Marxist parties all the way to Islamic resistance parties there. And so we've been just trying to gauge kind of how different Palestinian groups are viewing this. And one thing that stands out is the remarkable sense of unity that exists across the board on a basic set of principles among Palestinian factions, including some that are historical rivals. For instance, there's a significant minority within the ruling Fatah party of Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, who really want to join with all of these other Palestinian factions and reject the colonialist aspects of the Trump plan. Palestinians are not saying that they don't want an international force to come in. In fact, everyone from Hamas down to more secular, smaller parties has said, we want a force to come in under the auspices of the United Nations that can function as a barrier between the Israeli occupation forces, the genocidal army of Israel, and the Palestinians, so that we can negotiate and discuss these broader demands of the Trump plan. Palestinians are in wide agreement that they want Palestinians to be in a position to be the interim government of Gaza. They don't want Donald Trump and Tony Blair serving as the viceroys or the high commissioners, that used to exist under the British mandate. And there's also discussion about what would it look like to discuss the future armament of a Palestinian state. No Palestinian is saying, yes, we want to give up our rights to armed resistance against Israel. but they are open to a broader discussion in the context of the establishment of a Palestinian state. What has happened, and this has gotten almost no reporting, is that since July of 2024, when 14 major Palestinian political parties met in Beijing, China, including Fatah of Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas, they all met and they agreed on a set of principles. This was July of 2024, and they issued something called the Beijing Declaration, which laid out a unified Palestinian position both for how to end the genocide, how to deal with Gaza after the end of the genocide, and also how to deal with the international community. And they wanted a reconstitution, a reorganization of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which since the 1970s has been recognized in the Arab world and by the international community as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. But what happened is that in the 1990s, now most people have heard of the Oslo Accords, but there were a series of agreements that started with secret letters in the late 80s and went through the 1990s. Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO at the time, and Mahmoud Abbas, who now is the head of the Palestinian Authority and the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, signed a series of agreements that didn't guarantee a Palestinian state, that in fact codified a surrender of 78% of historic Palestine. We won't have it anymore. And just 22% of Palestine was supposed to have some form of limited self-governance. That's what the basic thrust of the Oslo Agreement was. This was deeply unpopular among a broad swath of Palestinian society, but it has been the law of the land, so to speak, in how Palestine has been allowed to function. And so the Palestinian Authority that Mahmoud Abbas is the president of was originally established in 1994 with a 5-year mandate. Mahmoud Abbas was elected to a 4-year term in 2005. Since then, there has not been an election. And Abbas's popularity by some polls is in single digits, others it's in the low teens. He's just kind of governed and he has full spectrum control. And so what our article, the real news in our article that really hasn't been reported in the Western press at all and isn't a major discussion yet in the broader global press, is that in the past week, Mahmoud Abbas issued an edict changing electoral law for local elections in Palestine. And many believe this is going to be cut and paste applied to national elections if they ever happen. That's part of what should happen with the Gaza plan. And what he did is he said, no candidate can run for office that does not affirm formally their support for the prior agreements made by the PLO or the quartet agreements made in the early 2000s with the United States, European Union, and others that basically say, we recognize 78% of historic Palestine is gone. We recognize the state of Israel. We renounce our right to armed resistance. That's what they're saying, that in order to do that, in order to run for office in Palestine, you have to renounce all of these things. It means that pro-resistance parties, and armed resistance remains one of the single most popular points in public polling, that you are not allowed to run for public office anymore. And when you look at what the defense of this is on the part of the Palestinian Authority, it's a pathetic defense. What they're saying is, oh, we have to comply with Trump's demands because they don't want Hamas to be in the government anymore and they have to disarm Hamas. Or they say, well, if we don't do this, we're going to have international funding cut off for the Palestinian Authority or for local projects. But Ryan, it's not just Hamas that is objecting to this or Palestinian Islamic Jihad that's objecting to this. Every major human rights organization, civic organization, electoral right organization in the NGO sector in all of Palestine joined together and denounced this law and said it's fundamentally undemocratic and anti-democratic. They put it up for limited public discussion. They got inundated with people saying and groups saying, no, this is a terrible law. They ignored them and they rammed this thing through. And then this morning, one of Abbas's ambassadors.
Yeah, let me put this up here.
You can say it. He attacks me, mischaracterizes anybody who follows my reporting, the idea that I believe any of the things that he said, that I think that Mahmoud Abbas is the biggest threat to Israel. He attacks me, but doesn't say that a single thing we reported is wrong because they can't say it because it's true, because the vast majority of Palestinians are against this law. And what we did was report on that sentiment.
Yes, the rhetorical maneuvering here is interesting. Like he says, it is suspicious that everyone who does the same as you aligns with the Israeli perspective, which sees Abbas as the real danger to Israel, and believes that the existence of the Palestinian National Authority is the main safety factor for the Palestinian people. They also consider the Oslo Accords, which many dislike, as the sole contractual agreement through which Israel recognized the Palestinian people and the legitimacy of their representation after decades of denial. The Israelis want as far as to kill their own prime minister because of Oslo, talking about Yitzhak Rabin. As for Trump's plan, which no one likes, those who disapprove of it should come up with a realistic alternative, not vague slogans or outdated illusions, or remain silent and let us work in the interests of our people, whose leadership, I believe, is the most keen on its welfare. The latter part feels to me the most honest. Like he's saying, just stop talking. Like just let us do this. Like that feels like something honest slipped out. Like that does seem to be like their preference.
And that's, I mean, that basically is what they've also been saying, you know, in their own social media or when they do comment on it in public. But there's a couple things to unpack there. I mean, first of all, person on planet Earth believes that the greatest danger facing Israel is Mahmoud Abbas. In fact, as I pointed out in my response to the ambassador, beginning in late 2024, early 2025, the Palestinian Authority security forces, many of which are trained or supported by the United States or work in collaboration with Israel, began a series of raids targeting Palestinian resistance fighters in the occupied West Bank. We reported on this at the time at Drop Site, and that then cleared the way for Israeli occupation forces to invade parts primarily of the northern refugee camps in the West Bank and engage in the single largest forced displacement campaign against Palestinians in the West Bank since 1967. At every turn, Mahmoud Abbas is being used by the United States and also at times by Israel to sort of tell Palestinians, you shouldn't engage in armed resistance anymore. We need to just accept all of these deals that were made in the 1990s. And by the way, Mahmoud Abbas himself personally signed parts of the Oslo Accords at the White House in 1993. So he's been doing this his entire career. This man has not faced an election since 2005. He's facing down even people within his own party, significant voices in his own party, saying that the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is no longer representative of the will of the Palestinian people. He's acting in servitude to Trump's plan while paying some lip service of criticism to what many Palestinians are saying. And at the end of the day, he's ignoring the fact that Palestinian factions have been meeting for almost 2 years and laying out their own vision for how they want to proceed going forward. So, you know, there's a very dire situation happening when it comes to who speaks for the Palestinians. And Hamas remains the single most popular political party. But as we've said many times, if there were elections tomorrow in all of Palestine, the most popular candidate, according to all public polling, is Marwan Barghouti, who is from Abbas's party originally. He's from Fatah. But Hamas and the Palestinian resistance have been trying to get him freed in these exchange deals. He represents a grave threat to Mahmoud Abbas and to Israel because Israel is very content to have Mahmoud Abbas there. Israel doesn't want Gaza and the West Bank to be unified under a common government. We explain in our story how in 2017, Yahya Sinwar, who had just been elected the head of Hamas's political bureau, tried to broker a deal with Mahmoud Abbas for the Palestinian Authority to actually return to Gaza and take power in Gaza. And Mahmoud Abbas ultimately rejected that deal. And some of the people we interviewed said, if the PA had done that, and of course they didn't do it because the US and Israel didn't want them to. Israel does not want Palestinians to have a unified government over Gaza and the West Bank. They want it to be divided. And, you know, Ryan, that famous quote that a lot of people misinterpret, and it's every single day you see it. When Netanyahu said, he said it during this attempt at reconciliation or right after he had thwarted it. He said, anyone who wants to thwart the existence of a Palestinian state has to keep the money flowing to Hamas. People are like, oh, this is evidence that Netanyahu supports Hamas. What Netanyahu was saying was something insidious. He was saying, we need to divide and conquer. He was talking about a situation where the Palestinian Authority had worked with Israel to cut off electricity to Gaza. where the Palestinian Authority was refusing to go back in and unify the governments in Ramallah and in Gaza as one. And Netanyahu was claiming victory and saying the best way to prevent the Palestinian state is to divide Gaza and the West Bank. It wasn't about funding Hamas as a political organization. It was saying, give them enough money so that they barely can function, and then keep Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority from reaching any agreement that would unify Palestine. I think it's really important for us to talk about the nuance of this, because it's exactly what they're doing right now. It's a redux of Oslo mixed in with the divide and conquer strategy, create cantons or little Bantustans around Gaza. Maybe they're going to split it in half. The Israelis are in control of more than 50% right now, and they're saying they're going to build a green zone and try to entice Palestinians to come over. They're also drawing a line through the West Bank and trying to divide it. There's talk of even trying to deport 1 million Palestinians from the West Bank, saying they're actually really Jordanian citizens. Smotrich has talked about this. So all of these things are happening. The U.S. doesn't like Mahmoud Abbas. Israel doesn't like Mahmoud Abbas, but not for the reasons Palestinians don't like him. They view him and the Palestinian Authority as even too much Palestinianism on the scene. They don't actually want Palestinians at all. So it's like, even though Abbas has spent his career in servitude, even though the sycophancy is off the charts, you still have Trump sanctioning Abbas. You still have them sanctioning PA officials. You still have them accusing them of supporting terrorism, even though Abbas canceled the payments to the families of prisoners or martyrs who died resisting or were imprisoned resisting Israel. So no matter what he does for them, and this is really indicative of how deep this Zionist sort of supremacy runs, no matter how much servitude Abbas engages in, no matter how weak and decrepit the PA is, it's still too Palestinian for the Israelis. So, there's a reason why Trump and those guys don't want to talk to Dr. Mustafa Barghouti.
We just lost Jeremy. We'll see if he. You're back.
Sorry.
So
just to close it, there's a reason they don't want to talk to all. The bottom line, what people should know is there's unprecedented unity across the political spectrum in Palestine right now. And Abbas is collaborating with the Americans and the Israelis, and they're very happy to have him there in a sense, because they can use him as a veneer of legitimacy, but they don't even want Abbas himself to be in charge because he's Palestinian.
And you have a key detail about the Beijing declaration that I think is interesting. So could you give a little context to, and let's think about the particularly July of 2024, but more generally the spring and summer of 2024 as both a turning point and a potential hinge point in the genocide, but also a hinge point when it comes to Palestinian unity, because as you write about in the piece, Abbas, Fatah signs on to this declaration, which is a significant threat then to actually create a unified political structure. Immediately reneges on it when he comes back, when he returns. But so let's remind people like what's going on, kind of militarily and politically, in the summer of 2024. And a reminder to anybody who needs it, the Biden administration is in power at this.
So you have Joe Biden. Joe Biden is in the White House. Antony Blinken is basically running the U.S. strategy behind the scenes. In May of 2024, it seemed clear that the Palestinian side was going to make some concessions and agree to another ceasefire deal. In fact, many of the terms were identical to the one that then goes into effect in January of 2025.
And the Biden team has claimed credit for the January 2025 deal, saying this is the same terms that we had in place in May. So that part is true. They just didn't get the deal.
It's true, but Trump, even before he was in office, used the substantial powers of the office of the American president to ensure that the Israelis were going to accept that deal. And of course, he then allowed them to blow it up and to continue the genocide. But it's actually a damning indictment. If I were a Biden administration official, I wouldn't be running around making that point, because
it's not making the argument you think it is.
I mean, to say, oh well, we created a reasonable framework that then was adopted in January. Well, why wasn't it? It was because, and now Biden people are on record as saying this openly in interviews, that they didn't want to pressure Israel too hard in fear that it would blow up a ceasefire deal, that Israel was sabotaging. I mean, it's still, it's great that they are saying this openly. So you had this on July 2nd, Hamas, and we broke this story. Hamas signed a declaration that it delivered to the mediators saying we accept these terms based on American amendments that Blinken had told the mediators will get Israel on board with this. Israel then turns around, as it always does, and says, no, there has to be new terms now. So in the midst of this, you had some of the heaviest bombing. You had intense forced displacement operations. This sort of matrix system was being unfurled where Palestinians were being pushed into ever shrinking kill cages. And then you had all of these Palestinian factions gather, and they signed a rather lengthy document that not only was putting forward conditions that were very much in line with what the world, including the United States, was saying were necessary for a ceasefire, an exchange of captives deal, but also addressing every possible question about what happens after a ceasefire becomes permanent and we have to contend with reconstruction and governance. And they talked about forming interim bodies that would be run by Palestinians to ensure that the democratic will of the Palestinian people was at the center of any response that would be given that had to do with their own future. And an agreement that they would reform the Palestine Liberation Organization so that it truly could serve and it would mean that it was the actual sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Abbas didn't attack it when it happened. His party agreed to it. What happened is that he paid lip service to saying it's great when we have, Palestinian unity, but then he turns around and he implements policies that run in the total opposite direction. And he himself is denouncing Hamas and feeding into the demonization narrative. And so you had this moment in time where if you had a president in the United States that had real political will, that wasn't an ideological Zionist, that actually was interested in creating a better reality for Palestinians, they could have made a deal that would have had the democratic support of all Palestinians, and every issue would have been on the table. And instead, the U.S. under Biden allows Israel to blow up that deal. The scorched earth bombing goes on again. Trump comes into office. They impose this ceasefire. It lasts through one phase. The Israelis unilaterally abandon it. They begin their terror bombings again. And then you didn't have an agreement take place then until October. And the Palestinians only agreed to negotiate on the terms of ending the acute war, exchange of captives, the resumption of military aid, and an initial framework for Israeli withdrawal. Everything else in Trump's plan, which is a neo-colonialist plan, they said has to be handled according to the principles of Beijing with a wider cross-section of Palestinian society. And so what the US is doing right now, and actually Emmanuel Macron is deeply involved with this. France is working with Abbas to write a new Palestinian constitution, and he's been caught on tape talking about this with Abbas on sort of hidden camera pickup. No Palestinians have been shown a draft constitution, but Emmanuel Macron has. No Palestinians were shown the actual final text of this law, anti-democratic law on elections, but France saw it first. So the US, the EU are in this conspiracy with Mahmoud Abbas to strip the Palestinians of a democratic voice and to ultimately serve as the facade, the window dressing for a Palestinization of Trump's day after plan in Gaza. And most Palestinian groups, with the exception of Abbas's clique, are saying, we reject colonialism from the time of the British to the present.
I think there was some hope at the time of this summer, and based on the fact that Beijing had hosted this summit, that perhaps they were going to get more involved and become an actual
China, you mean?
Oh yes, yeah, China. Yeah. That China would get involved and become an actual neutral mediator, like that. The thing that has been, there's no such thing as a neutral mediator when you're talking about a country. Like all countries have their own interests. So two questions on that front. Do you think that Beijing's involvement, China's involvement, actually kind of hardened U.S. resistance to some type of a ceasefire, because they say, wait a minute, we'd rather see this destruction and this calamity continue rather than see China actually get something useful out of this for their own purposes. And it raised a lot of hopes at the time that China might actually get more involved, and that could lead to a peaceful resolution. What did you hear at the conference from Palestinians about those hopes, which seem to have been dashed so far, as they've been like, you know what, forget it?
I was speaking to Palestinians at this conference right on the eve of the UN Security Council resolution on November 17th, which was a shocking, unprecedented move, embracing and legitimizing or seeking to put a stamp of legitimacy on Trump's Gaza plan, including the deployment of a force, an armed force that would not actually be under the command of the UN, but under the command of Trump's so-called Port of Peace that Trump is the chair of. And there was some, I think, cautious optimism that either China or Russia would veto that, in part because all of the resolutions that Russia and China supported for the 2 years of the genocide leading up to this that would have implemented a ceasefire, the US vetoed them. And China and Russia circulated an alternative draft, but then they quickly withdrew it and they both abstained and they allowed it to go forward. I do think that in a broader geopolitical sense, the US at that moment in the summer of 2024 was concerned because China was also engaged in other diplomacy and negotiating other peace agreements involving Saudi Arabia and Iran, and was wielding its soft power in a way that, you know, hawkish people within both the Democratic and Republican parties find deeply concerning. You know, China is able to extend its influence without having to deploy large amounts of military force. They operate through economic and other means, and because they largely stay out of trying to dictate the internal affairs of the countries that they want to do business or extract natural resources in. You know, they have a cold, calculated way of looking at the world. But I don't think that was the defining factor. I think the defining factor was Israel, that Israel was in control of whether there was going to be a ceasefire or not, and Biden's people just refused to ever push it through. So, yeah, I think there were some concerns about China, but I don't think the fact that the Palestinian factions happened to have signed this in China, or that the Chinese foreign minister brokered this in a formal capacity, was the key factor. Ryan, I know we only have a couple minutes left to talk about this before Sami comes on, but there is something I want to bring up, and that is that there has been very little reporting in the US media or in the world media about these Palestinian fighters that are trapped in tunnels in areas that are currently under Israeli control. This is a huge issue for Palestinians that everyone is paying attention to on a daily basis. There are fighters from Qassam brigades or other armed forces that are stuck in these areas, and Israel has been trying to manufacture its own victory moment. They want them to come out and wave a white flag. They want to snatch them and take them as prisoners of war. And they've been systematically murdering these men in tunnels. Israel claims they've killed more than 40 of them. Some videos have been put out in an attempt to try to humiliate them.
How many do people suspect there may be?
At the beginning, there was an estimate. It's hard to know. There was an estimate that there are a couple hundred of them. And you know, remember, a ceasefire is not Israel makes an agreement not to murder civilians. It's Israel it signed a ceasefire agreement with the armed combatants in this war. That means they signed a ceasefire deal with Hamas, whose armed wing is the Qassam brigades. They signed a ceasefire deal that encompassed all of the Palestinian resistance. And so what they're doing is they are murdering in an extrajudicial manner the armed forces of a party that they have signed a ceasefire agreement with. And I want to point out one thing about this too. Ghazi Hamad, who is on the Palestinian negotiating delegation, he's a senior Hamas official. He was one of the people that was targeted in that assassination strike in Doha. We learned this week that his son was one of the Palestinian fighters that was killed this week by Israel, attacking these men, even though there's a ceasefire. Bassem Naim's son, who's another senior Hamas official, was killed a few weeks ago. The second son of his, who was in the Qassam brigades, that was killed. Dr. Khalil al-Hayya, who is the political leader of Hamas in Gaza, his son was killed in that Israeli assassination strike in Doha. Other sons of his have been killed. I'm bringing this up because the way that the Israelis talk about Hamas's leadership is that they live in five-star hotels and that they are enjoying the high life while their own people are being killed. But if you contrast the fact that these Hamas officials, in fact, I don't know a single Hamas official, and I've interviewed many of them, that hasn't had a direct family member killed, and most of them have sons who are enlisted in the resistance fighting against Israel. Contrast that with Netanyahu's son, who's living the party boy life, in Miami, or Trump's son, or the sons of all of these powerful people. People could say whatever they want. You could have debates about political leaders of any movement, but this is a story that isn't getting attention. These are people whose own sons are in these resistance movements while they're negotiating. So one of the Palestinian negotiators who could have probably intervened to get his own son out in some form of a negotiation, that's not what happened. What happened is that their children are dying like those of everyone else in Palestine.
To underline your point, in a ceasefire, it's just, it should not, we should not allow it to be not shocking. Like,
you can't say, like, if you sign a ceasefire and you say, but they're Qassam brigades. No, you signed a ceasefire. Who you signed the
ceasefire with.
Like, that's not how ceasefires work. But I feel like I'm losing my mind on that one point, because people are saying, oh, but they're terrorists, or oh, but they're Qassam brigades. That the ceasefire was signed with Hamas. That's their armed wing. Like, you can't then say we still have a right to murder these people because they're in the Qassam brigades, because that's who you signed the ceasefire agreement with. So this is a huge story that every Palestinian is paying attention to, and most of the rest of the world is not paying any attention to it whatsoever. It is a massive crime that is taking place. This is extrajudicial murder of an armed force that is under a ceasefire agreement.
Yeah, I see that Sami Hamdi is in the waiting room here. Let's bring him in. I know you have to go in a second, but wanted to bring him in while you're still here. Sami, thanks for joining us. I think we'll take like a 2-second break while Brad kind of situates the screens. Brad, let us know when you're good. Good now, right, Brad? All good. All right. Well, Sami Hamdi, British journalist, joining us now. Thanks so much for joining the Dropsite News live stream.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So Sami, how are you?
I'm very good, thanks. Glad to be home.
Yes, I'm sure. For those who, and Jeremy, actually, since I'll let you ask the first question because I know you've got to run. But for those who didn't follow the situation, Sami was here in the United States about a month ago to speak at a series of care events, care galas, which is the Council on American-Islamic Relations, the largest Muslim-focused civil rights group in the United States. You spoke at one or two. You were in Northern California, flying from Sacramento to Florida to speak at another care gala, and were just picked up at the airport on the demands of some people on the internet, amplified by kind of right-wing activist and journalist Laura Loomer. Spent 2 weeks in detention, headed back to the UK. But Jeremy, if there's anything you wanted to start with, because I know you have to run, I don't want to monopolize.
Well, I mean, first I just wanted to say to Sami, thank you for your principle and your integrity, and and the way that you came out. I mean, I was so struck when you came out and you took the focus off of yourself. I mean, you described what happened to you, but you put the focus on where your journalism always has been. And for people who didn't follow your case, though, maybe you can give us a brief overview of what happened and set it in the context of what we're witnessing now in the world with attacks on journalists, the attempt to criminalize activism in the UK and the US and beyond.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be with both of you. I'm actually a fan. I followed your work for quite some time. I think that to put it in the broader context, I think it's important to highlight that the Israelis are not just attacking the Palestinians, but rather there is a brute force attack even on the rights of ordinary Americans. And I sort of got caught in the crosswind. I was not the first victim of this. The first thing that the extreme Israeli lobby tried to do first was to threaten the naturalized citizens of the United States of America, to limit their ability to speak freely, not about the American government, but about the Israeli government itself. This is the whole irony of it, in that I wasn't detained for criticizing the US, I was detained for criticizing a foreign government. But the point is, they went after this idea of threatening the likes of Mehdi Hassan and these others of their passports and their citizens, and then they failed in that regard. They went after US citizens born in the United States. those associated with American Muslims for Palestine in Michigan. They tried to drag them through the courts and in Nevada. And the judges in Michigan and in Nevada said, what on earth is going on? These are US citizens. We have freedom of speech. They can say what they want, back off. Then the Israeli lobby said, oh my God, what do? I can't get the US citizens. Let me go after student visas. So green card holders. So they went after Mahmoud Khalil. They tried to get Mahmoud Khalil deported. The judge ruled he can't be deported. They went after him again. And now he's still in this limbo. But certainly they are struggling to deport him, a green card holder, for speaking not against the Americans, but speaking against the Israelis. Then the Israeli lobby said, okay, we're struggling with citizens. We're struggling with green card holders. The American federal court system is standing against us. Americans seem to believe that their freedom of speech is greater than Israel, which is deeply problematic. Therefore, they went after the student visas. Rumaysa Ozturk wrote that article, the op-ed. They went after Mohsen Mehdawi in Colombia, and they went after Liqa Kurdiya, who also protested in Colombia, who's still detained actually in Texas. And then they found that the courts released Rumaysa, they released Mohsen Mehdawi, and they said this is really problematic because these defeats are public. The Americans are standing against Israel first. The American system is standing against us. The Americans are asserting they have a priority over the Israel first. Oh, wait a minute. There is a guy who is from London, who is touring the United States, criticizing the Israelis, criticizing the genocide that's taking place, denouncing the genocide. Let's go after tourist visas. At least we'll settle for that if we can't go after the US citizens. And maybe that will be a launch pad through which we can later go after the Americans themselves. 2 weeks prior to my detention, Dinesh D'Souza, a right-wing figure, I don't know how you guys want to describe in America, he put up a video in which, of a lecture I gave in Kuala Lumpur. And in this lecture, I said rather passionately that because everybody is shouting on social media, because you're finally showing Americans the truth of what's happening in Palestine, because you guys are screaming and showing everybody the realities of this genocide that's taking place, ordinary Americans, good Americans are seeing that truth and their hearts are shifting, even in, quote, corners that you never thought possible, like the likes of Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and the like. Dinesh D'Souza took that video and decided to attach Islamophobic tropes, by which he tried to play on those fears that Hollywood and some of the media played on in the past, where he wrote, Muslim Brotherhood operative celebrates Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson's role in spreading Islam in America. Luckily, Elon Musk Grok would respond and say there's nothing there that indicates anything of what Dinesh D'Souza is claiming. But Ted Cruz took this opportunity to retweet it and really bring it to prominence until Laura Loomer would eventually come along and she would tweet on the Monday, guys, there is somebody, I'm paraphrasing here, there is somebody criticizing the Israelis, touring the United States. We need to get rid of his visa. On the Wednesday, she flew to Washington and she tweeted that there is good news coming about a certain individual touring the United States. I knew she was talking about me, but 4 days later, I'm in San Francisco airport, about to fly to Tampa, Florida, to give a talk at the CARE Gala, to say to the Americans and say to the audience that you need to save America from this Israel first lobby. You need to save those homeless who are freezing in the cold because Congress gives $14 billion to the Israelis to commit genocide before they give it to Americans. You need to save America, where you have families going bankrupt as a result of their inability to pay medical bills because Congress can find $8 billion to give to the Israelis first before they give it to the Americans who need to pay their medical bills, because your kids who are struggling to go into college and to find unemployment and to find employment, Congress finds money to give to the Israelis to give them free healthcare and let them commit genocide and let them occupy territory that does not belong to them first before they give it to the Americans themselves. Save America from this Israel first lobby. I'm about to fly to Tampa and somebody walks up to me and says to me, and I'll just make it very brief, says to me, are you Sami Hamdi? I said, yes. He said, your visa was revoked 2 days ago and I'm here to inform you that you are now here illegally. I told him, nobody told me that my visa was even under review. There was no indication of this whatsoever. Sir, I'm sorry. Here's the paper. Here's the memo from the State Department. Okay, my friend, what's the reason for it? The paper doesn't state a reason. Sir, they didn't tell us the reason. They just told us to wait for you here and to take you, and you have to come with us. I told him, listen, if my visa's been revoked, I'll just book a flight now, go home to London. I was supposed to go home 2nd of November. I don't mind going home 5 days early. There's 6 flights a day from San Francisco. I'll fly. He says to me, that's not how this works. I said, I don't understand. You want me to leave the country because my visa is not valid. I'm not interested in fighting with you here about it. I'll fight it at home. But why can't I just go home? Why do I need to go with you? Let's just solve it. And then 6 other agents appear out of nowhere, Ryan. It's like something out of a movie. They appear out of nowhere. Then they escort me out of the airport. And there's a black car with tinted windows just waiting for me. And they told me, get in the car, very aggressively. I said to them, with the greatest of respect, guys, I don't need to believe that you are who you say you are. I'm a British citizen. I'm a journalist. I have rights. I need to speak to a lawyer before I do anything. Can I call a lawyer? No, you can't. I said, guys, I'll just be blunt with you guys. I'm not getting into the car unless I call a lawyer. I called Hussein Ailouche from CARE, who told me comply with them, and we're on the case. When I asked them to speak to my family to let them know I'm okay, the agent behind me grabs me, throws me against the car, cuffs me from behind, throws me in the car, and I go on a 6-hour ordeal all the way to a random facility in McFarland, California. And then a process would take place whereby the federal judges on the 2nd day and the 11th day would rule that there were signs of serious infringement on my right to freedom of speech. And therefore, the Department of Homeland Security, which was saying all sorts of things publicly, privately, they were saying, listen, Mr. Hamdi, can we just clear this up? You know, we know you want to go home. We'll clear the whole record. We'll pull some strings. You go home. The sense was almost as if who in the State Department listened to Laura Loomer, and we didn't mean for this to escalate. The media pressure, really, I think they felt it in that regard. And I was able to go home after 2 weeks. But the final point I will say on this is I was able to go home in 2 weeks because of the attention that was put on me and that spotlight. But some of the stories in there, Ryan, are tragic. You know, some of the inmates who've been there 9, 10, 11 months, horrific situations, including those who've been in America 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about that. Like how many, like how big a facility was this, and what kind of people were you in there with? Because I do want to like really absorb that thought that, you know, we knew immediately when you were grabbed, because, you know, we know who you are. We knew, like, CARE did a good job of, you know, publicizing.
And Laura Loomer publicized it. Guys, I got him.
Right. Yes. And yes, Laura Loomer did an even better job of publicizing. Absolutely. And so we knew, and there's a sustained level of pressures, not as if the mainstream media really cared much, but enough attention was focused that it makes it a little bit of a hassle, you know, for them to keep you in a long stretch. Also, like, to your original point, like, for what? Like, they want you gone, you want to go. So, like, who's fighting? Like, what are we even fighting over? It's just the cruelty. Like, they want you to just suffer indefinitely, and then they get what they want. So that part of it makes it kind of untenable for them, because their demand is so absurd. Like, when you go in front of a judge and the judge is like, well, he's willing to go, you want him out. Like, what are you even doing here? So that is eventually going to get resolved. In the cases where there isn't that level of attention, like what were, like, tell us about some of the cases that you saw in there.
So I'll tell you about 3 particular experiences. The first was when I entered the facility. So there was 2 Indian guys and a Latino guy in front of me when they were checking us all in. Mm-hmm. So the Latino guy goes first, and the lady checking us in says to him, so where are you from? And he says, as a joke, he says, I'm from Afghanistan. And she says, oh, your people want to kill my people. And we all went, what? And she said, yes, your people, they want to kill Americans. So I said, excuse me, that's categorically not true. And he panics and he goes, no, mi Mexican amigo, you know, no Afghanistan. And she says, no, I said, listen, it's categorically not true. No one wants to kill Americans here. It's just simply not true. In the end, she walks off afterwards in a huff, but it's to give you a sentiment of the mindset of some of the guards who are watching over us, and therefore that mentality that leads to some of the cruelty that's manifested against some of those inmates in and of themselves. But when you're there and you ask those inmates, you ask them some of their stories, you'll find a guy who's lived in America 37 years, lived all his life in Oklahoma, married to an American citizen. His kids are American citizens. He lived his life with a green card, just never bothered to apply for citizenship because never saw the need to apply for it. You know, I'm living a good life. It's fine. It's not an urgent thing for me.
I'm terrible at paperwork. I can imagine myself
exactly
in that same situation. Like, I'm good. Like, I can't find the right documents.
There's no immediate, issue, whatever. It's all good. Yeah. I have my rights and the like. One day he goes to update the details of a green card. He goes to the appointment and they grab him. They grab him and they immediately detain him and they put him in facility, and he's baffled. What on earth is going on? When he's there, of course, he knows he has a strong case. He has presence in the US, has a good job, has a good family, settled and the like. ICE know that he has a good case. So ICE immediately say to him first, they put him in a cell, they'll cuff him on his legs, they'll cuff him on his hands, they'll put him in a shackle, they'll make him sleep in those foot cuffs for 24 hours in Fresno, in a cell that maybe 15 people in maybe a 6x7 cell or 6x6 cell, so very cramped and the like. Then they'll say, listen, after all of this, dragging you through the night and this horrible experience from the movies, if you want to get out of here, just sign this deportation order and we'll make you all better and you can end up going home. And many people actually sign this in the beginning, not knowing what they're doing, simply because they think home means back to Oklahoma in Ohio. For those who remain there, ICE know that if they appear in front of the judge, they might be freed. So ICE will come and say, for example, in my case, my court case was 6th of November. So they took me to Fresno on the second day in the cuffs and the like and told me, listen, this can all go away if you just sign this order. I read the letter. It says I'm guilty of whatever it is they're accusing me of overstaying on my visa. None of what they were saying publicly ever made it into the charge sheet. It says you overstayed. I said, I didn't overstay. My visa
none of this, like he's a supporter of terrorism and all that.
None of it was even mentioned in private. Like none of it was even mentioned. I didn't know about it except when my family were telling me they're saying these things online. But privately, even the lawyer they appointed specifically for my case never mentioned it. She said, listen, I've already pulled the strings. I've already called everybody. I'll make it very easy. He can go. His record is clear, and let the storm pass. And then he can apply for a new visa and then come back whenever he wants. But the point that I'm saying is that in my case, my court date was 6th of November. Randomly on the second day, 10:30 p.m., Hamdi, what's going on? You're going to Fresno. Why am I going to Fresno? I don't know. Maybe you're going to be transferred to Texas, which all the inmates went, you don't want to be transferred to Texas. Trust me, you don't want to go Texas. Florida and Texas are the worst facilities you could possibly be in. California is way better in that regard. So when I went to Fresno, they left me in the cell for about, 12, 13 hours and then late for another extended 6, 7, 8 hours. Just to say to me, sir, your court date has been moved from the 6th to the 10th. Why? Because on your charge sheet, it says that you landed in Santa Ana, California. I said, yes, I did. We changed it to you were pre-cleared in Calgary, Canada, which is where I took off from. I said, I don't understand. They're both right. Why is my court date delayed? Well, every time we edit the sheet, the court has to know, and so that it gets. So a lot of these inmates, they suffer from this. There's a case of somebody from Texas 3 days before his final hearing. So you have a master hearing, evidence hearing, and a final hearing. And because of the backlog, it's usually a total process of 9 or 10 months if you're patient enough to wait those 10 months. He's 3 days before his final hearing, Ryan. So he's been there about 9 months. ICE are worried that the judge is going to release him. So in the middle of the night, ICE called G4S, the company that does the transportation. They remove him from Texas. They fly him to California. Because he can no longer appear in Texas, he has to start the process again from the master hearing and sort himself out again. He can't see his lawyer in the facility anymore. And now he's in the process of reapplying again to try to start the process again. There is a Latino brother called Antonio. So this guy was convinced he was going to get out. He married to a U.S. citizen, 17 years in the United States. Children are all U.S. citizens, had a good job, only has a DUI on his criminal record from 16, 17 years ago. But that's about it. He's getting ready to go home. His court date is about 3 days after I've entered. He taught me a bit of basketball because I play football or soccer. I played it semi-professional. I don't understand this basketball game of yours. But anyway, in any case.
Pretty similar.
Very similar. In any case, he says to me, my court date is tomorrow. I'm getting ready. Okay, we're looking at his evidence sheet. Not that any of us know what we're doing, but, to encourage him. He gets out. We're all applauding for him. Go on, Antonio, you got this. You're going to be free. He comes back 15 minutes later. Antonio, what happened? I went in and I said they didn't have time to read all the evidence. And the judge said, well, everybody needs to read the evidence. Guys, how about we reconvene 29th of January? So 3 months later. So my brother is stuck there for 3 months more in that facility, simply because ICE couldn't be bothered to make their preparations. And the judge sort of said, well, let's just wait. People are being delayed through the bureaucratic loopholes. ICE aren't detaining people because they think they can deport those people. What they do is 10, 11, 12 months into it. I had an Uzbek lecturer applying for asylum next to me in the bed who was crying at night saying, I came to the land of the free to escape my country that was oppressing me. I'd rather risk going back to my country than to stay here one more day. Please deport me. Please just get me out. And the others were telling him, Just be patient. You can win your case. 2-3 months, you can win it. There was an Uzbek guy here 2 months ago who won the case. He stayed here 13, 14 months and he won. I can't do it. I can't do it, guys. And you feel like it's a game, you know, who blinks first? ICE at every point say to you, well, if you don't like it here, just sign the paper and we'll send you home. And you're like, but I have a case. It's illegal what you did to me. And the final story, I'll tell you this, Ryan, just very shortly. There was somebody who was granted asylum. Or one was granted asylum, one was granted release on bond. One was married to a US citizen, one is asylum. But what happened in their cases is exactly the same. The judge has ruled for the former green card holder and for the asylum that they are to be released. ICE should not keep them in detention. So I said to them, so why are you still here? They said ICE are desperately trying to find a third country to take us. So they're hoping that they'll be rid of us before we appear in front of the judge, because they're worried if we appear in front of the judge will angrily say, release them. So a guy, for example, born in Congo but lived all his life in Texas, they said they can't deport me to Congo. So they called the Ghanaian embassy. They looked on a map and they said, what country is next to Congo? Let's call them and see if they'll take them, even though the judge has ordered for his release, Ryan. And that's the point, in that ICE, they play on those bureaucratic loopholes. And as I left, and this is the point I finish on, as I left, the inmates, they said to me, because when they found out, they called me the famous one, the journalist in there. They would tell me, you're going to get out of here quickly because people haven't forgotten you outside. But when you get out, our problem is people don't talk about us. And if they did, you would find that they would deal with us differently. And the proof is, on my way to the airport when ICE were taking me, so one of the deals with the lawyer was no cuffs. So I didn't have any cuffs and I was going to the airport. And then the ICE, who were very vicious to me in the beginning, until the headlines, and then they made the cuffs a bit lighter, etc. The ICE, for the 2.5-hour journey to LAX, they spent their time telling me sob stories about how hard it is making other people's lives miserable. Like how hard it is to go and detain people. And we didn't mean to treat you like a criminal. And I'm baffled. Then as I'm getting off the van, they said, sir, go easy on us. Don't write too harshly about us. But the point is, the good treatment they gave me, they knew the bad treatment was illegal. They knew the bad treatment was wrong. When a spotlight is shone on them, their treatment changes. They talk differently. They act differently. And that's why I want to take this opportunity while you're here, in that a lot of people are focusing on ICE detaining people. They're not focusing on the conditions that ICE keeps these people in. For example, Liqa Kurdiya in the Texas facility, there are snakes in her facility. She's not given proper clothing in line with her religious freedoms and the like. The judge has ordered her to be released, Ryan, twice. Twice the judge has said that she's not a threat to security. She should be released on bond, and still they keep her detained in that Texas facility for God knows what bureaucratic reason in that regard. I believe that more media attention on this means that these people end up getting released, because I promise, if ordinary Americans knew what was happening to the family members of ordinary Americans, we know the White House press secretary, her relative recently, or her in-law was recently detained by ICE. If they knew those conditions, I don't think the American people in the land of the free and home of the brave, I don't think they would accept those conditions for anybody.
Did you hear any stories from any of the other people detained of success stories over time? Like like you said, well, an Uzbek guy was able to get out. But did any get redress for any crimes committed against them? Is there any examples of anybody fighting back that actually worked?
So I didn't hear one that worked. What I heard was there are quite a few who patiently waited and they were released while I was there. So the judge ordered their release. And as they would walk out, I remember they would tell the guards, who worked for Geo, they'd say, I knew I was coming out, but why did it take 14 months? Why did it take 15 months? And I know some have started to sue ICE for the treatment that they were subjected to after the court has brought that redress. And there's a big movement, especially amongst those who are married to US citizens and those who lived a long time in the US. There's a big movement in which their family members are gathering together to try to sue ICE once their relatives are released, because they know that the judges will eventually exonerate them. They know the judges will eventually release them, and that it's a waiting game. I remember being in the visiting area. Thank God I had a lot of visitors who came, and you could hear the family members telling the inmates, be patient. We know we can win. We know it's been a long time. We know it's been 12, 13, 14 months. Be patient. We know you can win. The lawyers know you can win. The judges have been releasing people one by one. Those who've been waiting on average 12 months end up getting released, or 11 months or 13 months end up being released. Be patient, then we can sue them. I think there's a growing movement amongst the inmates and their families to sue ICE once they're being released. It is worth noting that this is, I wouldn't say it's a recent phenomenon, but the intake is certainly, there's been a huge intake under the Trump administration of ICE detentions and the like. I do think that there is a movement brewing in this regard to sue ICE in this regard. And I do want to say that I think ICE are very worried about it. ICE are very concerned about it. And when I saw the way that their treatment altered because of the media pressure, I think ICE are in serious trouble if those inmates choose to be patient in those facilities, if they don't buckle, if they don't blink, and believe that the law, however tardy it might be in being implemented, will eventually be implemented. We're seeing it in those federal courts. And that's why in my case, I was very grateful to the saner and clearer heads in the State Department and in the federal courts that sort of turned around and said, what on earth is going on? A journalist is being detained just because he criticized Israel. Let him out and let him go home. And I think that is the sentiment. As long as there's a bit of patience, I think the courts will prevail in this regard.
And last question. I'm wondering if, so I don't know if you're following the other big story here in the United States where Pete Hegseth is under fire for, his entire campaign of attacking people in the ocean is itself a war crime. It's not even a war crime because it's not even war. It's just a crime against humanity. But one particular strike in which 2 people survived and then were struck again has gotten an enormous amount of attention because it is so egregious. In fact, there's an example in the military's own code of own code of conduct and the way that you have to follow international laws. It uses as an example, you can't kill shipwrecked sailors. So he did the thing that is used as the obvious example of the thing you can't do. He has now since blamed this guy, Admiral Bradley. He said, well, I support Admiral Bradley, who ordered this strike. That's Bradley, but I absolutely support him. So the takeaway from a lot of people is that this administration is going to hang people out to dry when the cows come home. And so I'm wondering if the guards or the other people in ICE or anybody else was starting to get that sense that, wait a minute, this is not just a governmental problem here. I might actually face some personal individual liability here, and I cannot actually rely on the loyalty of the Trump administration to me if that comes to pass.
I think, Ryan, you've hit the nail on the head. I can only speak about my own experiences in America. I found that we have to understand America's image abroad is one in which it just bombs countries left, right, center. It launches coups. Even in the Arab Spring, when people wanted freedom, the Obama administration felt that the Arabs had chosen wrongly and therefore decided to support many coups instead in that regard. And that continued later on. And we see now the relationship between the autocratic regimes and even the Trump administration. What I found when I came to America is that a lot of Americans, once they become aware of what's happening, once they become aware of the horrors that are taking place and the atrocities, a lot of them end up moving and they end up mobilizing, which is why we're seeing with this pressure with regards to Hegseth. It's so egregious what took place that it's the public pressure that's being manifest, in which even Donald Trump cannot seem to protect Hegseth, and Hegseth his head might roll as a result of this incident that took place with regards to shooting those 2 who were hanging onto the boat, and I think it was kill them all. That's what Hegseth said, or something along those lines. I think that if we apply it in my context and even more broadly, I think the war that's taking place in America right now is, how do we keep this stuff away from the American people? How do we divert their attention to something else? How do we spend $50 billion on TikTok to ensure that the Americans don't see what Israel is doing in Palestine? Because when they see it, they turn against the Israelis and sympathize with the Palestinians. How can I buy CBS and put Barry Weiss in charge to control the flow of information to Americans? And this is why I started with, it wasn't an attack on me. It was an attack on the Americans. Americans are waking up. How do we put them back to sleep? How do we make sure that we dehumanize the Venezuelan in front of the Americans so they will allow us to do what we want to do to Maduro? How do we desensitize the American and prevent them from seeing the realities of what's happening in Palestine so that Israel can ensure that Congress funds Israel before it supports the Americans instead? This is why this is a war on America. It's not a war on Venezuela or Palestine. It's a war against the American people, who these enemies of America believe that if the Americans see the truth, they will result in tangible changes in the administration, whether it's Hegseth or whether it's previously with Mamdani winning in New York, or whether it's the Democrats winning in Virginia, doing a resounding no, whether it's the SNAP, 42 million people almost got taken off SNAP, and as a result of public pressure, some of that was reversed. It's about how do you prevent Americans from receiving that information? And that's why, to bring it back to your point about ICE, what ICE are terrified of, ICE are terrified that Americans will realize what they're doing. ICE are terrified that Americans will find out what they're doing. ICE are terrified that when the Americans find out, it won't be just that ICE will be prevented from detaining these people illegally, but that those who are employed by ICE, those who fulfill those orders, those guards from G4S, which does the transportation in horrible conditions in the way that they left me in cuffs until my legs were blue, and they do the same to other people who are also inmates too. I think that ICE are terrified that if the Americans wake up, no administration can stand in their way. And this is why I want to emphasize this point, given it's the last question, and I want to send this message out more than anything else. This case wasn't about Sami Hamdi. This case wasn't about even the Palestinian cause in and of itself. This was about trying to restrict the freedom of speech and the freedom of information. This was the Israelis saying to the Americans that you can have freedom of speech, but not when it comes to us. Your rights are subject to how we define them. And I was lucky in my case in that Americans came out for me and said, this is outrageous. Ryan, I had even Wolf Blitzer say to me that, Mr. Hamdi, I find what happened to you to be disgusting. And this is somebody who used to be a member of AIPAC. Right. The point that I'm saying is that if Americans wake up, there's no way these atrocities take place. The war that's taking place now is America first versus Israel first. It's about how can you wake up enough Americans to the tragedies and atrocities that are unfolding, and how do you prevent the Israelis from putting them back to sleep? If you can wake the Americans from their slumber, I truly believe a lot of these atrocities being committed by the administration, I think they will cease, because the Americans, the backlash will be such that I think the administration, when forced to choose between survival and between these egregious policies, I think, especially in Trump's case, he'll look at the polls and he'll adjust accordingly.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, I hope you're right about that. I know that a lot of people have some doubts, but hopefully the American people do learn about it and do put pressure. We're doing as much as we can. You're doing even more. Sami, really appreciate you joining us. Actually, for people who watch Breaking Points, they'll see you again tomorrow morning
Thank you
on that show. So I'm looking forward to that as well. But thanks so much for joining us here. And where can people find you? Because if people don't already follow you,
I think if you put Ryan Grimm on Google, all the stuff comes up, and I assume if you put Sami Hamdi on Google, all the social media links and that stuff will come up as well. And it's great to see you, Ryan. And I do want to affirm that Drop Site News and Breaking Points, you guys have done a lot in terms of waking the American people up to the realities that's unfolding. And I hope you guys continue. And I do believe in the message of hope. I do believe that goodness triumphs over evil. I just think that the road of goodness and the path is a difficult one. You're not fighting against easy. It's good versus evil. And I think it's a noble path. And I actually think you guys are on the front lines of it. So keep doing what you're doing and we'll follow. Well,
deeply appreciate that. And, thank you so much for joining us too.
Thank you, Ryan. Take care.
All right. Up next, we're going to bring in José Luis Granados Ceja, and we'll take a 2 or 3 second break while kind of Brad situates things. Jose, how you doing?
Very good. Good morning, everybody.
Gonna pop through.
Good morning. Good to be here again.
Excellent. All right. So joining us now again, José Luis Granados Ceja, journalist out of Mexico City, who is now in Honduras and has been there for the last several days covering this election, back for his third time by increasingly popular demand. I was saying 2 weeks ago, you were here to talk about the Mexico City protests. A week ago, you previewed the upcoming elections, which then, after your appearance, took on even more attention as President Trump intervened in those elections. Actually, let me see if I can add this. So this was the post or one of the posts from Trump on Truth Social, where he says, if Tito Asfora wins for president of Honduras, because the United States has so much confidence in him, his policies, and what he will do for the great people of Honduras, we will be very supportive. If he doesn't win, the United States will not be throwing good money after bad, because a wrong leader can only bring catastrophic results to a country, no matter which country it is. Tito will be a great president, and the United States will work closely with him in order to ensure the success with all of its potential of Honduras. Additionally, I will be granting a full and complete pardon to former President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who has been, according to many people that I greatly respect, treated very harshly and unfairly. This cannot be allowed to happen, especially now, after Tito Asfora wins the election, when Honduras will be on its way to great political and financial success. Vote for Tito Asfora for president, and congratulations to JOH on your upcoming pardon. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Make Honduras great again. He put up a separate post calling the Libre Party candidate, Moncada, a communist, and calling the Liberal Party candidate a near communist. At the time, polls had a Moncada in first, although the polls were a little bit all over the place. But in general, Moncada was looking to be in first. The Liberal Party in second. Asfora, the National Party, the party of Juan Orlando Hernandez, a drug trafficker, in third place. And so people on the left thought, wow, this is actually perhaps going to further split the vote and just advantage Moncada. That appears not to have happened. So to walk us through like what you saw on election day, and what your kind of people that you're in contact with saw on election day, and compare it to what we saw with the results. And basically the question is, what on earth happened?
Yeah, that's the question. And I think a lot of people are still wrapping their heads around that. I think we still don't know actually who won. We've had a lot of issues around the count. There is a lot of dispute in terms of who actually got first place. If we're looking at the early results, it looks like Trump's candidate, Tito Asfora, is the winner, but it's by the slimmest of margins. We're talking about hundreds of votes here. So it is a very, very tight race, less than 1%. And obviously that's generating these conditions of instability, of uncertainty. It's widely expected that there's going to be a lot of challenges. Fortunately, we haven't seen unrest on the streets, which was a fear, I think, of a lot of people here, that given the very polarized, tense climate ahead of the election, with Trump's open, flagrant intervention, that this could produce an unstable situation here in the country. Fortunately, we're not seeing that. But a lot of people are on edge. Things are not clear. And so in terms of what happened, on the one hand, looks like the polls were wrong. One of the difficulty about polling in Latin America, and certainly in a country like Honduras, is that they end up, being very much influenced by the people who are paying for the poll. So it was really difficult to know which is the ones that was actually reliable. There were a handful of them that seemed to have gotten a little bit closer to the actual result. But nonetheless, the result is the following, right? So either first or second place for the National Party and the Liberal Party, which are largely conservative parties, the National being further to the right than the Liberal Party, but there really isn't much of a difference. They're very much viewed as kind of oligarchic elite parties that defend those interests. And
what just real quickly, what is the difference between
the two? I mean, these are the two parties that have dominated Honduran politics for basically all of modern history. The Liberal Party is a little bit unique in the sense that that's actually where Mel Zelaya, the president who was ousted in a U.S.-backed coup in 2009, that's where he actually stemmed from. But it's the sort of party that's always kind of reflected specific oligarchic interests. Certainly some that are, I think, perhaps closer to the center, a little more interested in more of a distribution of wealth, but really these are thoroughly neoliberal parties that are committed to that kind of model of privatizations and all the rest of it, with the exception of Mel Zelaya, who obviously went on to found Libre, the leftist party, a party that is aligned with all of the other left governments here in the region, left parties. It's very much kind of in that mold. And so the Conservative Party, it is probably the strongest political party in terms of its reach and its penetration into Honduran society. It's one where people strongly identify from all sectors of society. But that too is it's a very conservative party, one that is very much wedded to neoliberal orthodoxy. And so just to conclude the earlier, right, and the surprise really was that Libre which is the government that's in power right now, elected 4 years ago on a landslide, basically on a campaign that was a referendum on Juan Orlando Hernandez, and I think we'll get to him in just a second. He was an authoritarian far-right president. She wins, and they were in power, and they were seeking to remain in power with their new candidate. The Constitution prohibits re-election here, Rixi Moncada. She ends up in third place, and a far third. It appears that she'll probably settle around 20% of the vote. So that was a surprise to many, especially if you were on the ground, because you saw the large mobilization of Libre Party supporters. Certainly in all of the polling locations I was able to visit, they were the ones who had the largest, loudest presence. It was, you would see on the streets people driving down in their pickup trucks with a giant Libre flag, the sort of enthusiasm you didn't see from the other parties. But to explain, I think, what happened there, from judging from what I've talked to in terms of ordinary Hondurans, there seemed to be a lot of disappointment, a lot of frustration. They felt that, this government was elected on a promise of change, of actually transforming things. And in a lot of ways, people felt like they didn't meet that. They fell short of those expectations of actually, marking a watershed moment for Honduran politics. And so there was a bit of a punishing vote for that, of failing to meet people's heightened expectations that were raised by the party themselves, by their program, by their commitment. I mean, the name Libre is actually a combination of words, Libertad Refundación, or liberty and refoundation. So you could see that their commitment was, to really major transformations that I think a lot of people felt that they just simply didn't meet. And I think the other factor is, of course, the influence of Trump. That is a huge element here. It appears to have actually worked. And that, for me, is a terrifying notion. This is now the second time we see direct U.S. intervention in an election in Latin America that affects the result. Obviously, I'm talking about Trump's bailout in Argentina, 20 billion there, which obviously helped Milei and his party. He was set to lose. And now we see here the National Party could very well become the victors in this election, depending on how the vote count goes.
I guess the interesting follow-on here is that, now Trump is going to have to deliver. Like, if this is going to work, for many decades, the way that Americans would intervene in elections was, generally, militarily, arming insurgent groups, orchestrating coups. More recently they started adopting, social media and like public pressure campaigns, as we saw in Bolivia, and as we've seen kind of around the world. But this intervention is new. This is a straight up posting on social media. And when it came to Argentina, put an actual dollar price tag on it. When it came to Honduras, just said, money. And at the same time, FinCEN, a federal agency, announced it's going to crack down on remittances. So, they're going to try to tell Western Union, for instance, that, if they think that somebody might be here illegally in the United States and is sending money back to Honduras, they need to stop it. So that's a choke point that they have. So, but if Trump is going to be explicit and tell the Argentinian people and tell the Honduran people that if you vote for the left candidate, your life will be miserable, but if you vote for the right-wing candidate, your life will be better. For that to continue working as an American strategy, he actually has to deliver. So what is the sense among Hondurans that Trump and the United States will do? Or is it just, we don't want to become Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua? Because the counter examples are obvious, that the U.S. has options to immiserate people. So maybe it's just, as long as we're not completely immiserated, that's sufficient.
Well, he's held up half of his promise. As of yesterday, Juan Orlando Hernandez, the convicted drug trafficker who was sentenced to 45 years in prison, has been pardoned by Trump. Yeah. And that has been a major part of the conversation. Juan Orlando's his wife herself has confirmed this. He is now a free man. It's incredible to say that out loud. And I think a lot of Hondurans are reckoning with that. So at least in terms of keeping that part of the promise, that much is true.
Just I will also say that, pause you real quickly on that. Is there, what kind of fear is there among his opponents in Honduras who worked for this outcome and now find him free?
He's a narco trafficker. He's a drug trafficker, and he's tied to criminal elements. And those criminal elements have extraordinary power in a country like Honduras. So it's it's a lot. There's a lot of questions in the air in terms of what that's actually going to translate into. I think the first question is probably political. It depends on who wins the election. But in either case, we may see the return of Juan Orlando to Honduras, right? And that will shake things up here. On the one hand, for the National Party, Tito Asfura kind of has his own base of support. He kind of almost, when he ran in the primary, he ran essentially as the anti-Juan Orlando Hernandez candidate because his rival was Juan Orlando's wife. And so if he's returned, he's going to create another pole of, political attraction inside of his own party, the National Party, which I don't think the incoming president wants, but we'll see what plays there. Same way, if Nasrallah wins, then that means that he probably wants Juan Orlando to come back to weaken his opponents, to bring that kind of uncertainty back in. Although this is a powerful figure. He was in power for 8 years. He had a lot of influence here. So I think it's really going to shake things up. And of course, Libre, which fought against him very specifically, they won in 2021, basically on a campaign saying "Fuera Ho" or "Ho out." That's the nickname they use for him, JOH. So it's really, really quite uncertain. You were asking about in terms of what the impact is. Right. The U.S. policies already have an impact on poor people here. So Honduras was a beneficiary of a lot of USAID support, and obviously Trump canceled those earlier, and so there's been a ripple effect of that as well. Obviously, either the liberals or the National Party here are going to implement privatizations and policies, neoliberal policies that are going to punish and hurt people's pocketbooks, which is interesting because that was one of the ballot box issues about feeling like the cost of living had gone up under this government of Xiomara Castro. So we'll see in terms of whether they're smart enough to actually try to channel some money and maybe some foreign direct investment to kind of generate some employment, even if these are really bad jobs. For example, the maquiladoras here, they make a lot of T-shirts. People can probably look in their closet and find a T-shirt made in Honduras right now. Yep. And those jobs don't even pay minimum wage. They're exempt from that. So it's really quite an unfortunate circumstance, I think, for most working class people in this country. We're now going to have to deal with a very difficult circumstance. And of course, another issue here was also, as mentioned, a sense of disappointment, right? Of actually fixing the problems in this country. Juan Orlando Hernandez basically robbed the Social Security Institute blind. So hospitals don't have medicines, they don't have equipment, there aren't enough doctors. There was a very modest improvement of that. I think Libre suffered as a result of not solving those issues for the Honduran people, but they're probably only going to get worse under this new leadership, be it National or Liberal Party.
And I think Libre, and this from reading, I suggest everybody read your piece. The takeaway I took from your dispatch was that Libre also suffered from extremely poor timing. If their election, if you think about their election coming at the back end of 2021, that's just as global inflation is really starting to hit. And Libre, any government in Honduras, there's only so much they can do when it comes to their control over global forces. Like they're buffeted, severely by movements in commodity prices, in the Federal Reserve interest rate policy. So that alone, I feel like, probably made it like extraordinarily difficult for them to be set up for success. Yet Castro still wound up, personally with a very high approval rating. It feels like, you tell me, if she was constitutionally able to run for re-election, that with a 60+% approval rating, even if that's inflated by 10 points, she probably actually wins re-election. One of the things that she was in the news for here in the United States was her fight with the kind of crypto crowd, which saw in Honduras a place where they could test out their utopian/dystopian vision for basically what they call these kind of sovereign areas. And I've done some reporting on this, where in Honduras they would set up, they were called ZEEDs. These like you take like a kind of liberated economic zone that we understand around the world, and you just take it and put it on steroids. Like no government whatsoever except for the crypto company. And when I would engage with them for comment and for interviews, they would refer to themselves as like government ministers. Like they would talk about themselves. It's like, guys, come on, you don't have, like, nobody thinks you're a government, but they would say, you need to talk to our Minister of Transportation about this. You need to talk to our Minister of Communications. Like, you don't have a minister. You're a company. Stop. But so Juan Orlando Hernandez had gifted them with these Actually, as he was the head of this assembly when he pushed it through, and then as president, helped enact it. These basically countries run by crypto lords, which then Castro took away. Then the crypto guys sued her at the World Bank, which is incredibly ironic, by the way, for a libertarian to go to a global institution like the World Bank and sue there. But they're not going to let irony or hypocrisy get in the way of a multi-billion-dollar suit. And so when Trump says that he heard from people that he trusts, Trump has a lot of friends in the crypto world. So is this a massive win, no matter who wins, between the Liberal and National Party? Is this a massive win for the crypto folks? Are they going to be able to kind of have their way with these zones? And then just real quickly, do you think I'm right that Castro wins re-election if she's able to run?
It's hard to know how that would have played out. I think she was individually more popular. There was a lot of disappointment. I mentioned this in the dispatch that we published just this morning within the social movements, right? Sort of the non-parliamentary left as well. I talked to people who were scared of a right-wing return, but still couldn't stomach voting for Libre again. So I think it's important to signal those kinds of frustrations that a lot of social movements expressed, especially in these areas, precisely these areas that these crypto bros, these so-called libertarians, want to encroach into. It'll be interesting to see, of course, their response. They feel like this is a moment for them to strengthen internally. They obviously had a lot of their sort of membership and their leadership kind of drawn into the state, as happens every time a left-wing government, right? There's only so many activists and organizers around, and they tend to be pulled into the state. And so you'll see probably people return and hopefully that they can accumulate forces and figure out a way to resist this. And we'll see. So it would be difficult to say exactly what would have happened there. But certainly doesn't matter who wins here, the Liberals or the Nationals. This is good news for those. I call them filibusters. And I don't mean filibusters like the ones we see in the Senate. I mean the filibusteros from previous centuries, people who would come down here and act like they could just take over a piece of territory of a sovereign country and act like they ran the show. I think it's far more accurate.
What was the guy's name? It was Nicaragua that
it was in Nicaragua.
That in the 19th century, an American businessman, very American name, William Walker or something like that.
That's right. Yes.
I think his name was. So look him up on Wikipedia. Wild story where he comes to Nicaragua and just says, you know what, I'm going to make a slave colony.
Yeah.
I'm going to take over Nicaragua and make it a slave colony, and does it for a while.
Yeah.
Before he's thrown out and killed. But yeah, you're right. This is not a new thing. It isn't. The innovation is the blockchain, but otherwise, this is a very old American approach.
Yeah. And I think when you ask about, why did Trump decide to throw his weight behind Tito Asfura, from what I've been able to discern, Nasrallah went to Washington. He hired lobbyists. He tried to get audience with people. And it sounds like he really just couldn't curry favor with the White House right now. And as an alternative, there was the National Party. And so that's why you saw this kind of pivot. There's a couple of key actors. Cerimedo is an Argentine political operative who's worked with a lot of right-wing organizations. It looks like he was a key figure. I mentioned this in the first report that we put in. He apparently was working with Dick Morris. We know Roger Stone is obviously a key player in all of this, and he's been talking to, people inside of the White House about, facilitating this support. But I think obviously, they have his ear. He went through with the pardon. He deliberately intervened on behalf of this. So anyway, in any case, if the National win, they obviously, as you just described, Juan Orlando, his party, they were the ones who kind of set up the framework for this to work. That was actually repealed by the Libre government, but there's still a lot of kind of roadblocks out of the judicial branch here that has made it so groups like Prospera is still around. And so it's quite likely that they're happy to have another National Party government. And Nasrallah was very much interested in working and talking to just anybody who would help him get into the presidency. And so he also probably, most likely, made a lot of promises to these same actors. So that is really bad news for those of us who are worried about, these efforts to attack Honduran sovereignty and to try to carve out these spaces inside of their territory that are going to become these zones of, rampant hyper, neoliberalism where even national law doesn't apply. And obviously there's violence behind that. And I think that part has to be emphasized, that there is a lot of violence in order to be able to enforce these kinds of zones. And that is a big concern for the social movements as well, because at least they had an opportunity, even if they weren't necessarily consequential, but at least they had audience with the state to seek that kind of protection. That's no longer the case here in Honduras. They're going to lose at least that recourse, which means that really the question is, are they going to be able to gather their forces to be able to resist the coming onslaught?
And for people who are watching this, they might be like, wait a minute, Asfora? Nasrallah? Is Hezbollah here? What's going on here? And so talk a little bit about the backgrounds here of these candidates, because Bukele, as a lot of people know and are surprised to learn if they don't know, was Palestinian. So now we could have a second Palestinian president in Central America, it appears.
Yep. So yes, both of them, they come from a lineage that actually predates British Mandate Palestine. There were people who left because of the economic situation there. Things got complicated with the colonial experience there, which
Ottoman Empire collapses after World War I.
Exactly. Right. And so there is a lot of actual Palestinian outmigration to places like Central America. Also, Chile has a very large Palestinian population as well. And because they came from the business community in Palestine, they very much kind of replicated that activity, and they became a lot of important business leaders. It's interesting because in the case of Bukele, his father sympathized with the left. He was friendly with the FMLN. He was, despite being a member of the ruling class there. Bukele obviously started in the FMLN, but broke away and has become this far-right actor. And it really is quite tragic that there's a possibility of having two Palestinian men or a Palestinian lineage in power in Central America, and both of them are far-right actors who will obviously, given the balance of forces globally and the influence of Zionism, will probably align as well with Israel, and which is, of course, such a tragedy that the Palestinian people will have to have some representation through these gentlemen who obviously don't champion their cause. Bukele is probably the worst example of that. He's a fervent Zionist and has visited Israel on numerous occasions.
Right. Well, so what's next in Latin America? Like, what are the next elections and other social movement contests that people should be watching for?
Yeah. So like I said, we have two experiences now where the U.S. has directly intervened. My colleague Kurt Hackbarth is calling it preventative fraud or preemptive fraud. So it's the kind of fraud that doesn't happen at the ballot box, and it doesn't happen with the vote count. All of this is, intervention for me that I would say that, it's very difficult to call this a free and fair election. I mean, when you have that kind of open interference, same with Venezuela, right? People always point to Venezuela saying, oh, the irregularities in their process and the rest of it, but they never talk about the blockade that the United States has on Venezuela. That is direct interference. How can you possibly have free and fair elections when you're starving the government? How can you possibly have free and fair elections when you're directly calling on Honduran citizens to vote? I also, talking with social movement leaders, one of the people I interviewed, Rita, says, I'm scared, not as an Honduran, but as a citizen of this world. What's next? And in terms of what's next, well, we know we have the second round of the Chile presidential elections. It looks like the right-wing candidate, Gast, who is a very hard right candidate. He's an admirer of Pinochet. He's likely going to win unless there's something extraordinary happens. Surprises can happen, as we just saw here in Honduras, because the right-wing vote was so strong in the first round. We also have Colombia coming up next. And Colombia, I think, is going to be a really important test because that's always been sort of the prize jewel of the United States on the South American continent. It's a place where they've always felt very comfortable. It's where they have bases. It's where they've been really frustrated with Petro. And I think they're very eager to disrupt as much as possible, to tilt the election with open, flagrant interventions. They're likely to come. And I think that puts us as observers, as people who are following Latin American politics, in a really difficult position, because how do you reckon with that? How do you reckon with the United States, which is emboldened and is going to intervene? And is going to continually do it. The sovereignty of the entire region is at stake. That's why I've always talked about, the need to defend sovereignty in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Cuba, now in Honduras, likely in Chile and in Colombia soon, because we have to have, this is a sacred right to freely decide the destiny of our countries. And the U.S. interfering the way it does really makes it so we can't. And what do we do in the face of that? And I think there's a big challenge also for people inside the United States to really weaken the ability to do this kind of thing, and really actually kind of undermining the legitimacy that the United States seems to have, or the gall that they seem to have to be able to intervene the way that they have now. Frankly, it's a very worrying circumstance.
Yes, indeed. Well, Jose Luis, thank you so much for joining us here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yep.
Always good to be here. This is such a great program. I echo the words of your previous guest. Great interview, by the way. Really is important work.
I really appreciate that, and safe travels back to Mexico City.
Thank you.
All right, that'll do it for us here at Dropsite News. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you have not become a paid subscriber, reader support is how we're able to do the work that we do. You go to dropsitenews.com, upgrade your subscription there. If you're not getting our newsletter yet, please do sign up for that. On behalf of all my colleagues here at Dropsite, thank you so much for watching.